but I'll tell you a little bit about how this argument evolved for me and how I came to the idea of the shock doctrine. The idea that our modern history, our contemporary history, has been shaped by this powerful idea that in order for the pro-corporate forces to get their way, they need some kind of a shock, some kind of a crisis that clears the ground, that readies the ground, that puts us into a vulnerable state, at which point you can have what economists call economic shock therapy. That's what the book is arguing. And the origins of this argument for me came out of the experience. Marcia mentioned that the film that Avi and I made in Argentina. We went to Argentina after that country faced a very severe shock. As many of you remember, at the end of 2001, obviously most people in this country were focused, they had their attention focused elsewhere, but it was a major international news event. Argentina's economy crashed in an absolutely spectacular fashion. This was a country that had been the model student of the International Monetary Fund. They had followed the corporatist rule book. They had privatized absolutely everything. They had deregulated. They had embraced free trade. They had become a country that imported rather than manufactured. They had decimated their manufacturing sector. They had cut every function of the state that helped people, like education and healthcare and social services. And the economy imploded. And the middle class lost access to their bank accounts. There was looting. People stormed the banks, pots and pans. You remember these images? So we went there, in part, to get out of here. And we made this documentary asking the question, once this economic model has been rejected, what next? What alternatives will emerge collectively? Because in Argentina, people didn't respond to that crisis by abdicating power. In fact, they responded to that crisis in a very different way than what the kinds of models that I talk about in the book. They responded to that economic crisis by completely losing faith in their political leadership. The chants in the streets of Buenos Aires in this period was, "Que se vayan todos," everyone must go, right? It was you people who did this. Yeah. I think they have a lot to teach us, actually. And right before the crisis really peaked, in the crash of the banks, there was already a great deal of disillusionment, and the government was trying to deal with the economic crisis by cutting more and more, imposing a new round of IMF-prescribed austerity measures, and there were federal elections, and the candidate that got the most votes in those elections was a cartoon character named Clemente. People stuffed their ballots with cartoons of Clemente. And Clemente is a very famous Argentinian comic strip. And Clemente doesn't have any hands. And the idea was that because Clemente didn't have any hands, he couldn't steal. So therefore, Clemente made a more credible politician than any of the ones on offer from any of the political parties. So this was the context, and so people turned to each other. They said, we can't trust our political leadership. They're all thieves. They're all involved in this crony capitalist model. We need to turn to each other. So we wanted to know what the alternatives would be when people turned to each other, and we ended up making this film about occupied factories, about places where people had been fired from their jobs, and rather than allowing themselves to be fired, they went back to work. It was the opposite of a strike. If you think about a strike, withholding your labor, this was, people unfired themselves. And it's quite interesting because, if you think about the tactic, the traditional tactic of a strike, it's not a very effective tactic if people don't want you to work, right? So the idea was the machines still work, the equipment's still there, we have the skills, we've done this work, we can do it on our own. So this was a really powerful moment, not just in Argentina, but in the whole region. In Bolivia, they had just thrown out Bechtel because Bechtel had privatized the water system and hiked rates up 300%. Made it illegal to collect rainwater, unfair competition. And really, in Bolivia, it was at the early stages of what ended up becoming really a national revolution that ended up bringing Evo Morales to power. They were in the early stages of that. Brazil, they had just elected Lula. In Venezuela, they had just repelled a US-backed coup d'etat against Chavez. So things were really happening in Latin America in this period. But across the region, it was a revolt against what Latin Americans call el modelo, which is the model. And everyone knows what the model is. It's privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending. It is this package of policies that we've all been living with. And it was just crashing in Latin America. It was no longer possible to impose these policies peacefully through free trade agreements, through the World Trade Organization, through the International Monetary Fund. It just wasn't working anymore. People were rejecting it on the streets and at the ballot box. So the idea for this book came from being in Latin America at this moment when the war in Iraq began. So here we were, and this ideology is crashing on the continent where it all began. And this is one of the things that I do in the book, is talk about how Latin America was the very first laboratory for these policies in the 70s, under the guidance of the so-called Chicago boys, the US-trained Friedmanite economists who worked hand in fist with the military juntas to impose these policies. So neoliberalism, as it's called in Latin America, was in crisis. And then in another part of the world, actually in the only part of the world where this economic model has not swept the Arab world, the Arab and Muslim world. It swept Latin America, Africa, North America, Europe. I mean, it's basically North Korea and the Arab world.